She was 31 years old when the bankman nailed the foreclosure notice to her front door and called it mercy for not putting her in irons over a debt that was never truly hers to carry. The man behind it was her late husband's business partner, a sharp-suited cattle broker named Whitfield Drummond, who had quietly siphoned away 2 years of profits from their freight company before vanishing his name from every ledger that mattered, leaving Della Marsh alone with his debts and none of his gains. With $17 sewn into the hem of her travel skirt and a single trunk of belongings, she did the only thing a woman with nothing left could do. She bought the burned-out shell of the old Whistlepost Saloon at the edge of Cooper's Bend, Wyoming, for $6 and a promise to clear the lot herself. The roof had caved in. The walls were black with old fire scarring. Townsfolk called it a fool's purchase, a waste of good money on a ruin nobody could save. But none of them knew that beneath the warped boards of its half-collapsed stage, something had been waiting 15 years to be found, something that would not only rebuild Della's life, but restore a forgotten promise to an entire town that believed its better days were long behind it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Marsh. If you believe a ruined place can still hold an unbroken promise, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. To understand how Della Marsh came to stand in the ashes of that saloon without flinching, you have to understand the home that raised her. She had grown up the daughter of a traveling repertory actor and a seamstress, in a household that moved more often than it stayed still, following theater circuits through the river towns of Missouri and the mining camps of Colorado before her father finally settled the family in a modest house outside Cheyenne when Della was 11. Her father, a broad-voiced man named Thomas Marsh, had spent 20 years building and striking stages in halls, barns, and saloons across half the territory. And from him Della learned something most people never thought to learn at all: the architecture of a stage. She knew how a platform was framed to bear weight, how trapdoors were built for quick costume changes and vanishing tricks, how false floors and hidden compartments were carved into the boards beneath performers' feet to hold props, costumes, or coin boxes safe from pickpockets in rowdy frontier crowds. She had spent her childhood crawling beneath stages with a lantern, learning the bones of them the way other children learned hopscotch. Her mother, Imelda, had given her something equally enduring: patience, and the particular dignity of making something beautiful out of very little. Imelda altered costumes by lamplight long after the rest of the company had gone to bed, turning frayed velvet and second-hand lace into garments fit for a queen's role. And she taught Della that skilled hands could always find work, even when fortune turned its back. When Della was 15, her father took ill with a lung sickness that ended his stage career, and the family settled permanently outside Cheyenne, where Thomas spent his final working years building and repairing furniture for the town's modest hotels and the church. And Della, beside him, learned to read wood the way other girls read books, to know its grain, its weaknesses, its secrets. She married at 22, a steady, quiet freight operator named Walter Marsh, a man who ran supply wagons between Cooper's Bend and the rail depot 30 miles east. Walter was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and together they built a small but respectable freight company over 6 years of careful work, reinvesting every spare dollar into wagons, mules, and good contracts with the merchants of Cooper's Bend. Della kept the books. She negotiated rates with a calm, clear-eyed confidence that surprised men who expected a freight operator's wife to know nothing of commerce, and more than one merchant in town came to trust her word over her husband's handshake. Because she never once allowed a figure to be wrong, Walter died of a fever in the spring of Della's 29th year, leaving the company to her in full, along with a business partner she had never fully trusted, Whitfield Drummond, a smooth, well-dressed man Walter had taken on 2 years earlier to expand their rail contracts. Della had voiced quiet concerns about Drummond more than once, noting discrepancies in shipping manifests that never quite matched the receipts, but Walter, ever trusting of a man who shook his hand firmly and looked him in the eye, had waved her worries away as a wife's over. After Walter's death, Della inherited not just grief but suspicion she could no longer ignore. And within a year, that suspicion proved devastatingly correct. It was in the autumn following Walter's passing that the full scope of Drummond's deception came into the light, though by then it was too late to stop the damage already done. Drummond, it turned out, had spent 2 years quietly diverting freight contracts to a shadow operation he controlled under a different name, funneling the company's most profitable rail shipments away while leaving Della and Walter's company with the thinnest margins and the heaviest debts. He had forged signatures on loan extensions, taken out credit against the company's wagons and mules using documents Della had never seen, and structured the debts so that Della, now sole proprietor in name, bore full legal responsibility for obligations she had never agreed to and profits she had never received. By the time the Cheyenne Bank's representatives arrived in Cooper's Bend with their ledgers and their patient, regretful expressions, Drummond himself was already gone, having sold his shadow operations assets and departed for territories unknown. Leaving no trail, a small-town sheriff had the resources or jurisdiction to follow. The bank was not cruel. Precisely the man who delivered the foreclosure notice, a mild clerk named Aldous Penny, even apologized as he hammered the paper to her door, saying he wished circumstances were different. But sympathy did not return. The wagons repossessed that week, or the mules sold at auction to cover what the bank called reasonable recovery of its losses, or the small house Della and Walter had shared, which went to settle the remaining balance. She was left, in the end, with a single trunk of clothing, her mother's sewing kit, a handful of personal letters, and $17 she had managed to keep hidden, sewn carefully into the hem of her traveling skirts the week before the banksmen arrived, a small act of foresight her mother would have been proud of. The townspeople of Cooper's Bend watched her loss with the particular helplessness of people who recognized an injustice but had no power to undo it. Merchants who had once trusted her word over her husband's handshake now simply looked away when she passed. Not from cruelty, but from the discomfort of watching someone fall and not knowing how to help without becoming entangled themselves. She spent 3 nights in the back room of the boarding house on credit she could not truly afford, turning over in her mind, again and again, the question of what a woman with $17 and nowhere to belong does next. The answer came to her on her 4th morning in Cooper's Bend, as she walked the town's single dusty street with no clear destination, simply needing to move rather than sit still with her grief. She passed a burned-out husk of the old Whistlepost Saloon at the edge of town, a building she had walked past 100 times without truly seeing it, its charred frame standing like a blackened tooth against the pale Wyoming sky. The saloon had burned in a kitchen fire some 15 years earlier, before Della had ever arrived in Cooper's Bend, and had stood empty and unclaimed ever since. Its roof collapsed across half the structure, its walls scorched black, its interior open to weather and vermin. Nobody in town wanted it. The land beneath it was worth little. Situated as it was at the unfashionable edge of town near the old stage road that had long since been bypassed by the new rail line, and the structure itself was considered beyond salvage by anyone with the sense to walk past it, Della stood before it for a long while, and something in her, perhaps her father's old habit of seeing a stage in any pile of boards, perhaps simple desperation, made her walk closer, stepping carefully over the threshold where the front doors had long since rotted away. Inside, sunlight poured through the collapsed roof in broad, dusty shafts, illuminating a floor thick with ash, fallen timber, and 15 years of blown leaves and nesting debris. But at the rear of the main room, half-shadowed beneath a section of roof that had somehow survived the fire intact, stood the old performance stage, a modest raised platform where touring musicians and the occasional traveling actor had once entertained Cooper's Bend's rowdier evenings, before respectability in the railroad had passed the town by. She found the building's current owner, a tired, elderly widow named Constance Ferris, who had inherited the lot from a brother long dead and wanted nothing more than to be free of the tax burden it represented. Constance sold it to Della for $6 and the promise that Della would clear the lot at her own expense, sparing Constance the cost and trouble of doing so herself. And the deed was transferred that same afternoon at the county clerk's office, with the clerk himself remarking, not unkindly, that he hoped Miss Marsh knew what she was buying into. What drew Della back to the ruin that evening, trunk in hand, was not romantic notion or foolish hope, but the quiet, practical recognition that a building with 4 walls, however damaged, was shelter, and shelter was something she desperately needed. She spent her first night sleeping on the cleanest patch of the stage floor itself, the one section spared the worst of the fire and weather, wrapped in a blanket from her trunk, listening to the wind move through the broken roof above her. It was on her 2nd day, while clearing fallen timber from around the stage with the kind of methodical patience her mother had taught her, that Della noticed something her father's training made her body recognize before her mind fully caught up to it. The stage floor did not sit quite level. One section near the rear left corner beneath where a curtain rail had once hung, sat very slightly raised, no more than the thickness of a coin, in a way that should not have happened with honest even construction. She knelt and ran her palm along the boards, feeling for the seam her eyes could not quite distinguish in the dim light, and found it a section of flooring roughly 3 feet square that had been cut separately from the surrounding boards and fitted back into place with a craftsman's care, concealed beneath a thin layer of stage dust and grime that had settled undisturbed for what looked like many years longer than the 15 since the saloon had burned. Della Marsh sat back on her heels in the slanted afternoon light filtering through the broken roof, and understood, with the particular certainty of a woman who had spent her childhood beneath stages just like this one, that she had found a trapdoor never meant to be discovered by anyone who did not already know precisely where to look. She did not pry it open that day. Her father had taught her that a hidden compartment built with such care had been built to protect something, and the people who built such things were rarely careless about who found them. She spent that evening by a small fire built from broken timber in the saloon's old hearth, turning the discovery over in her mind, and resolved that before she disturbed whatever lay beneath those boards, she would learn what she could about the building's history and about who might have built a stage with secrets sewn into its very floor. The following morning, Della walked into Cooper's Bend's small county records office, a single cramped room attached to the back of the sheriff's quarters, and asked the clerk, a soft-spoken young man named Eli Tanner, who had only recently taken the position, whether any records existed concerning the original construction of the Whistlepost Saloon. Eli, eager to be useful and visibly curious about the woman who had just purchased the town's most notorious ruin, dug through several dusty record boxes and produced a thin folder containing a property transfer from 1869, the year the saloon was built, along with several pages of business licensing documents and a handful of old newspaper clippings someone had thought worth preserving. The saloon, the records showed, had been built and originally operated by a man named Garrett Hale, a former Union Army quartermaster who had come west after the war with a modest pension and a partner, a traveling musician and occasional actor named Josiah Pruitt, who had helped design and build a performance stage at the rear of the establishment. The two men had run the Whistle Post together for nearly 11 years. By all accounts, a modestly successful establishment that served as one of the social centers of early Cooper's Bend, until the saloon burned in 1884 under circumstances the newspaper clippings described only vaguely as an accidental kitchen fire that claimed no lives but destroyed the building entirely. What caught Della's attention, reading through the brittle newspaper pages by the dim light of the records office window, was a smaller article tucked beneath the main fire report, dated only 3 weeks after the blaze. It described a dispute that had apparently been simmering in Cooper's Bend in the months before the fire, concerning a parcel of common land at the edge of town that the township had long used, informally, as a gathering ground for community events, livestock grazing during lean seasons, and burial of those too poor to afford a plot in the formal cemetery. According to the article, a land speculator from Cheyenne had been pressuring the township council to sell the common land, arguing it served no legitimate municipal purpose and represented wasted value, and that Garrett Hale, among a small handful of townspeople, had been one of the loudest voices opposing the sale, arguing publicly that the common land belonged to the people of Cooper's Bend collectively and could not rightfully be sold out from under them by a council more interested in the speculator's money than the town's welfare. The article ended abruptly, as though the matter had simply stopped being reported, and Della found no further mention of either the land dispute or Garrett Hale in any of the remaining clippings. When she asked Eli Tanner whether he knew what had become of Hale after the fire, the young clerk shook his head and admitted he'd only lived in Cooper's Bend 6 years himself, but he suggested she might speak with old Mr. Loyal Whitcomb, who ran the town's general store and had lived in Cooper's Bend since before the war, and who remembered, Eli said, more about the town's history than any record book ever could. Della found Loyal Whitcomb behind the counter of his store late that afternoon, a stooped, white-bearded man with sharp eyes that seemed to miss very little despite his age, and when she explained who she was and what she had purchased, his expression shifted from polite curiosity to something more guarded and thoughtful. He remembered Garrett Hale well, he told her, settling onto a stool behind his counter as though the conversation required some preparation. Hale had been, in Loyal's estimation, one of the most decent men Cooper's Bend had ever known, generous to the point of foolishness, the kind of man who extended credit to drifters and never once mentioned it again, who had personally helped bury more than a dozen of the town's poorest residents in the common land's modest burial ground because their families could not afford a proper plot elsewhere. The land dispute the newspaper had mentioned, Loyal confirmed, had indeed been real and had grown increasingly bitter in the months before the fire, with the speculator, a man named Augustus Pell. Loyal recalled the name with evident distaste, offering certain members of the township council private incentives to support the sale, incentives that smelled, even at the time, of something other than honest persuasion. And then, 3 weeks before the saloon burned, Loyal told her, lowering his voice as though the memory itself required discretion even now, Garrett Hale had stood before a full township meeting and announced that he possessed written proof, old surveys, original land grant documents, and a letter from the territory's founding land commissioner, establishing definitively that the common land had been set aside in perpetuity for the people of Cooper's Bend at the time of the township's founding, and could not legally be sold by any council, regardless of votes taken or incentives offered. He had announced he would present these documents formally at the following month's meeting, once he had them properly notarized and filed with the county. The saloon burned 11 days later. Garrett Hale was never seen in Cooper's Bend again, and the documents, if they had ever truly existed, were never produced. The land dispute died alongside the fire. The common land was sold to Augustus Pell's company within the year, fenced off, and eventually subdivided and sold for private development that left the town's poorest families without their traditional gathering ground and, more painfully to old Loyal Whitcomb, without access to the modest burial ground where so many of their own had been laid to rest. Della sat in silence for a long moment after Loyal finished speaking, feeling the shape of something terrible and important assembling itself in her mind. She thanked him and walked back to the ruined saloon as the sun began its long descent toward the western hills. And that evening, by lamplight, she knelt once more before the hidden seam in the stage floor and, with great care, began to pry it open. The compartment beneath was shallow but dry, lined with what had once been oilcloth, now brittle and yellowed but still largely intact, having protected its contents from 15 years of weather through the partial shelter of the surviving roof section above. Inside, Della found a leather document case, cracked with age but sealed well enough to have preserved its contents, several folded survey documents bearing official territorial seals, a handwritten copy of what appeared to be an original land grant letter dated to the township's founding in 1857, and a personal letter, written in a steady, careful hand, addressed simply to whoever finds this, when the time is right. The letter, signed by Garrett Hale himself, explained in plain, unhurried language that he had hidden the documents beneath his own stage rather than risk presenting them prematurely, fearing correctly, as it turned out, that those who opposed him would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from reaching the township records. He wrote that he intended to retrieve the documents once he had secured proper protection and witnesses for their notarization, but that if anything should happen to him before he could do so, he hoped whoever eventually found this hiding place would understand that the common land of Cooper's Bend had never rightfully belonged to anyone but its people, and that he trusted whoever discovered this truth to see it properly restored. Della read the letter twice in the lamplight, her hand steady despite the magnitude of what she now held, and understood with complete clarity that she was looking at the means to undo a 15-year-old injustice, and that doing so would inevitably bring her into direct conflict with whoever currently held legal title to land that had been stolen from an entire community through fraud and likely arson. The danger of what she now possessed became clear to Della within days. Once she made the necessary inquiries at the county clerk's office about the current ownership of the old common land. The parcel, she learned, had passed through several hands since Augustus Pell's original purchase, eventually coming under the control of a prosperous Cooper's Bend businessman named Harlan Cobb, who had subdivided portions of it for sale and now operated a profitable feed store and stable on a section that had once, Della realized with a quiet ache, served as the community's burial ground for its poorest residents. Cobb was, by every account she gathered, a respected figure in Cooper's Bend, a deacon at the local church, a generous donor to the schoolhouse fund, the kind of man whose standing in town would make any accusation against him sound, to most ears, like the desperate fabrication of a destitute widow looking for sympathy or advantage. Della understood she could not simply walk into town waving 15-year-old documents and expect justice to follow. She needed someone whose word could not be easily dismissed, someone with standing equal to or greater than Harlan Cobb's, and she found that person in an unlikely figure. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office itself still maintained records in the county seat at Laramie, and among the documents in Hale's hidden case was a personal letter of reference from the very land commissioner who had overseen the township's founding, a detail that gave the entire collection an authority no local figure could simply wave away. She traveled to Laramie with Loyal Whitcomb, who insisted on accompanying her both as a witness to Garrett Hale's character and as a man whose decades in Cooper's Bend lent weight to her claims, and together they presented the documents to a Territorial Land Office attorney named Margaret Quinn, one of the few women practicing law in the territory, who reviewed the survey documents and the founding letter with careful, methodical attention and confirmed, after several days of verification against the office's own archived records, that the documents were authentic and that the original 1857 land grant had indeed designated the parcel as common land held in perpetuity for the township's use, a designation that had never been legally extinguished despite the subsequent sales. When Della returned to Cooper's Bend with Margaret Quinn's formal legal opinion in hand, Harlan Cobb did not surrender quietly. He hired the territory's most expensive attorney to argue that 15 years of subsequent ownership, taxation, and improvement constituted legitimate claim regardless of any original designation, and for a tense, uncertain month, the matter hung suspended in a haze of legal argument while the town of Cooper's Bend watched, increasingly divided between those who believed Della Marsh had uncovered a genuine wrong and those who believed disturbing old history served no one and risked only chaos. The matter was resolved not through dramatic courtroom confrontation but through the patient, unglamorous work of documentation and testimony. Much as Della's own father had taught her, every important thing in life was eventually resolved. Margaret Quinn argued the case before a territorial judge in Laramie, presenting not only the original founding documents but testimony from Loyal Whitcomb and several other elderly Cooper's Bend residents who remembered the land dispute, the fire, and Garrett Hale's sudden disappearance, painting a picture sufficiently troubling that the judge ordered a formal inquiry into the circumstances of both the original 1884 sale and the Saloon fire itself. That inquiry, conducted over the following weeks, never definitively proved that the fire had been set deliberately, the passage of 15 years having erased whatever physical evidence might once have existed, but it established clearly enough, through township meeting records that had survived in the county archive and through Augustus Pell's own old business correspondence, subpoenaed from his now elderly former clerk, that the original sale had been procured through the kind of private incentives to council members that constituted clear and documented fraud under territorial law. The judge ruled the original 1884 sale void from its inception, restoring the land's status as common property held for the township, with provisions allowing Harlan Cobb compensation for his legitimate improvements but requiring the burial ground itself, along with a substantial portion of the original common land, to be returned to public trust. Harlan Cobb's standing in Cooper's Bend did not survive the ruling intact. It was not punishment exactly, no fine or imprisonment beyond the financial settlement the court required, but the quiet accumulating weight of a community's altered regard, the church board that had once welcomed his deaconship now meeting without him, the customers who began taking their trade to the newer feed store that opened on the opposite end of town, the social invitations that simply stopped arriving, He sold his remaining Cooper's Bend interests within the year and departed for territories unknown, much as Whitfield, Drummond, and Augustus Pell had each done before him, leaving Della to reflect, when she heard the news, that there seemed to be a particular kind of man drawn to taking what belonged to others, and a particular kind of quiet justice that eventually found each of them regardless. With the matter legally settled and the common land restored, Della Marsh turned her attention to the ruin she had purchased for $6. Now standing at the literal and symbolic center of Cooper's Bend's restored history, using a modest finder's fee, the Township Council voted to award her for the land's recovery, a sum far less than the land's true value, but enough, with careful management, to matter. Della rebuilt the whistle post from the foundation up, working alongside hired carpenters through the following spring and summer, rebuilding the roof, restoring the scorched walls, and preserving with particular care the original stage at the rear of the main room, the very platform that had hidden Garrett Hale's truth for 15 patient years. She did not rebuild it as a saloon. Instead, she opened it as a community hall and modern sporting house, a place where traveling families could find honest lodging, where the township could hold its meetings, where the restored common land just beyond its doors could once more serve as a gathering ground for the people of Cooper's Bend. Exactly as Garrett Hale had always insisted it should, she kept the stage as he had built it, performances welcome on the occasional traveling troupe's passage through town, and she had a small brass plaque mounted at its edge, reading simply, "Built by Garrett Hale, who kept his promise." The burial ground was restored as well, its modest markers cleared of 15 years of neglect, its boundaries formally recorded and protected under the same legal designation that had once been so easily violated. And on a quiet Sunday that autumn, the town gathered there for the first time in over a decade to honor those buried within it. Loyal Whitcomb among those who spoke, his voice thick with the particular emotion of a man who had waited a very long time to see an old friend's name properly honored. Della Marsh had been 31 years old when she stood before the burned ruin of the Whistle Post Saloon with $17 and a purchase everyone in Cooper's Bend considered a fool's decision. She was 32 when the same town came to understand what she had found beneath that stage floor was never simply a fortune in old documents, but the recovered promise of a man who had given everything, including his own safety and ultimately his place in the only community he had ever loved, to protect something that was never his alone to protect in the first place. She had not gone looking for buried secrets when she walked into that ruin with her single trunk. She had gone looking only for shelter, for 4 walls and a roof to call hers when nothing else remained. What she found instead was a stage built by an honest man's hands, holding within it a promise he had been unable to keep alive himself, waiting 15 years for someone patient enough and trained enough by her own father's careful teaching to recognize a hidden seam where ordinary eyes saw only old boards. The Whistle Post still stands today. If the old stage road out past Cooper's Bend still carries you that far, its walls are sound now, its roof whole, its stage swept clean each morning by Della's own hand before the day's first travelers arrive. The little brass plaque still catches the morning light exactly where she placed it, and beneath the boards where Garrett Hale once hid his truth, there is nothing now but solid, honest flooring, because, as Della told a curious traveler once who asked why she'd never built another hidden compartment of her own, a building that has finally told its secret has no further need of hiding anything at all. We are grateful, as always, for the time you have spent with us tonight. Here at the edge of an old Wyoming stage road where a ruined saloon once stood for nothing and now stands for everything, a forgotten promise was always meant to be. If Della's story reminded you that the most important things are sometimes hidden in the places everyone else has already given up on, we hope you will share it with someone who might need to hear it. We have one question for you before we go, and we ask it with real sincerity. What is a time you found genuine value in something or someone that the world around you had already written off? We would love to read your answer in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.